What if everything you thought you knew about Jesus was only half the story? What if somewhere buried beneath the sands of Egypt, hidden for nearly 2,000 years, there were ancient texts, gospels written in the earliest days of Christianity, that the world was never supposed to see? And what if the most advanced artificial intelligence on the planet, built by one of the most controversial men in human history, was finally given the task of reading them? That is exactly what happened. And what Grok AI found inside the hidden Gospels of Jesus did not just surprise theologians and historians, it shook them to their core. My name is not important. What is important is that you stay with me through every word of this, because by the time we reach the end, the way you think about Jesus, about ancient history, about faith, and about the power of artificial intelligence is going to change in ways you did not expect. This is not a religious sermon. This is not a scientific dismissal. This is a collision, one of the most extraordinary collisions of ancient mystery and modern technology ever witnessed in human history. Let us begin at the beginning. In December of 1945, near a small Egyptian town called Nag Hammadi, a group of local farmers were digging in the ground, looking for something as ordinary as fertilizer-rich soil. One of them, a man named Muhammad Ali al-Saman, struck something hard with his mattock. Beneath the dirt lay a sealed clay jar, of nearly a meter tall, ancient and undisturbed. For a moment, the farmers hesitated. Local legend warned that jars like this could contain evil spirits, but hunger and curiosity are powerful forces. Muhammad Ali broke it open. What tumbled out was not gold. It was not treasure in any conventional sense. It was 13 leather-bound papyrus books, each one containing texts of extraordinary age. The desert climate of Upper Egypt had preserved them for over 1,500 years. Inside those books were 52, ancient manuscripts written in Coptic, translated from even earlier Greek originals. These were not ordinary texts. These were gospels, secret gospels, texts that had been hidden, suppressed, and in many cases completely unknown to the modern world. Among them was the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Truth, the Gospel of Mary, and dozens of other writings that had circulated among early Christians before the church decided which texts would form the official Bible and which ones would be buried and forgotten. These texts are now known collectively as the Gnostic Gospels, and they contain teachings so radical, so different from the Christianity most of the world knows today, that the question of why they were hidden has haunted scholars ever since. For decades after their discovery, the Nag Hammadi texts were studied, debated, translated, and argued over by experts. Elaine Pagels, one of the most respected religious historians in the world, dedicated her career to them. Bart Ehrman, one of the most read biblical scholars alive, wrote extensively about the world they revealed. But despite all of this scholarship, the hidden Gospels remained largely inaccessible to ordinary people. The language was ancient. The symbolism was dense. The theological implications were enormous and complex. Most people knew these texts existed, but never truly understood what was in them. Then came Grok. Grok is the artificial intelligence built by XAI, the AI company founded by Elon Musk. Unlike other AI systems, Grok was designed from the beginning to be direct, unfiltered, and fearless in engaging with the most controversial and complex questions imaginable. While other AI platforms often hedged their responses on religious and historical topics, Grok was built to go where others would not. It was trained on an enormous corpus of human knowledge. Every religious text, every language, every archaeological finding, every historical record, every philosophical framework that could be digitized and fed into a machine learning system. When researchers and curious users began feeding Grok the texts of the hidden Gospels, the full translations of the Nag Hammadi library, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, and asking it to analyze them with the same rigor it would apply to any other complex data set, what came back was unlike anything the online world had seen before. The responses went viral. Millions of people watched and read as Grok dissected these ancient texts with a combination of linguistic analysis, historical pattern recognition, probability modeling, and philosophical reasoning that no single human scholar could replicate in a lifetime of work. And the things it found inside those hidden Gospels were not what anyone was expecting. The first thing that stunned people was what Grok found when it analyzed the Gospel of Thomas. This Gospel, unlike Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, contains no birth story, no miracles, no crucifixion account, and no resurrection narrative. It is simply 114 sayings attributed to Jesus. That is it. Just words, just teachings. And the Gospel opens with a statement that immediately separates it from anything in the mainstream Bible. It says, and this is a translation from the original Coptic, that these are the hidden sayings that the living Jesus spoke, and whoever discovers the meaning of these sayings shall not taste death. When Grok processed this opening, it flagged something extraordinary. The phrase, the living Jesus, is different from how Jesus is referred to in the canonical Gospels. In the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus is not a historical figure who died and was resurrected. He is described as perpetually living, as a consciousness rather than a person, as a source of wisdom that exists outside of time. Grok analyzed this framing against the linguistic patterns of other first-century texts and concluded that this was not a later theological invention. The stylistic markers in the Gospel of Thomas were consistent with oral traditions that likely predated even the Gospel of Mark, which most scholars consider the earliest of the 4 canonical Gospels. In other words, Grok's analysis suggested that the Gospel of Thomas might contain some of the oldest recorded words attributed to Jesus, older than anything in the official Bible. That finding alone sent shockwaves through both the academic community and millions of ordinary believers watching the analysis unfold online. But the Gospel of Thomas was only the beginning. When Grok turned its attention to the Gospel of Philip, another of the Nag Hammadi texts, the findings became even more provocative. The Gospel of Philip describes a relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene that is unlike anything in the canonical scriptures. It says, in language that has been analyzed and debated for decades, that Jesus loved Mary more than all the other disciples and used to kiss her often. The text is partially damaged, and scholars have long debated what exactly this meant in its original context. Was it literal? Was it symbolic? Was it a reference to a spiritual union described through the language of physical intimacy, which was common in certain early Christian and Gnostic traditions? When Grok analyzed the Gospel of Philip in its entirety, cross-referencing its language with other Coptic texts, with early Christian writings, with the broader Nag Hammadi library, it reached a conclusion that was careful but fascinating. The relationship described between Jesus and Mary Magdalene in this gospel was not primarily romantic in the modern sense. It was something far more specific to early Gnostic theology. Mary Magdalene, in the Gospel of Philip and several other hidden Gospels, is portrayed not as a repentant sinner, not as a follower in the background, but as the disciple who understood Jesus most completely. She is described as the one to whom Jesus revealed the deepest teachings, the inner circle within the inner circle. Grok noted that this portrayal of Mary Magdalene was suppressed precisely because it elevated a woman to a position of spiritual authority equal to or greater than the male apostles. The AI traced the historical record of how Mary Magdalene's reputation was systematically rewritten in the centuries after Jesus' death. It identified a specific moment, a sermon by Pope Gregory I in the year 591, in which Mary Magdalene was publicly conflated with the unnamed sinful woman of Luke chapter 7, effectively transforming her from the leading disciple described in the hidden Gospels into a repentant prostitute. This transformation, Grok noted, had absolutely no basis in the original texts. It was, by any analytical standard, a historical revision. The Catholic Church formally acknowledged this error in 1969, but for nearly 14 centuries, the version of Mary Magdalene that billions of Christians had learned was not the version found in the oldest Gospels. The deeper Grok went into the hidden Gospels, the more patterns it began to surface that no human researcher had fully articulated before. One of the most extraordinary of these was what Grok described as a consistent theological framework running through the Nag Hammadi texts, a framework so coherent across dozens of different authors writing across different decades and different locations that the AI flagged it as statistically remarkable. This framework centered on a concept that the Gnostic Christians called Gnosis, a Greek word meaning knowledge, but not the kind of knowledge you get from reading a book or memorizing a doctrine. Gnosis, in the hidden Gospels, refers to a direct, personal, interior experience of the divine. It is the idea that God is not out there, not in a temple, not accessible only through priests and rituals and official church structures. God is inside you. The kingdom of heaven is not a place you go after you die. It is a state of awareness you can enter right now. When Grok analyzed the sayings of Jesus in the Gospel of Thomas through this lens, it found something that left scholars speechless. More than 60 of the 114 sayings in the Gospel of Thomas either directly state or clearly imply this interior, experiential understanding of the divine. One of the most famous says, "If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you." Another says, "The kingdom of God is inside you and all around you, not in a mansion of wood and stone." Grok ran a probability analysis on the consistency of this teaching across the hidden Gospels and compared it to the consistency of similar teachings in the canonical Gospels. And what it found was that the interior, experiential understanding of the divine was far more consistently represented in the hidden Gospels than in the official Bible. In the hidden texts, this teaching appeared to be the central message. In the canonical texts, it appeared occasionally, but was surrounded by, and in many cases overshadowed by, institutional structures, hierarchies, rituals, and doctrinal claims. The AI was careful to note that this did not mean one set of texts was more authentically from Jesus than the other. But it did suggest that the hidden Gospels represented an entire branch of early Christianity, a branch with millions of followers in the first 3 centuries of the Common Era, that had been systematically excluded from the religion as it became institutionalized under Roman authority. This brings us to one of the most shocking findings of Grok's entire analysis, the question of why these texts were hidden in the first place. The official story has always been that the Gnostic Gospels were heretical texts written by fringe groups centuries after Jesus lived, filled with strange mythology that had nothing to do with the original message of Christianity. The Church had always portrayed the decision to exclude these texts from the canon as a straightforward theological judgment. These texts were simply not authentic. But when Grok analyzed the dating evidence, the linguistic patterns, the papyrus dating, the archaeological context, the references to historical events within the texts themselves, it reached a very different conclusion. Several of the hidden Gospels, including the Gospel of Thomas, showed linguistic and stylistic characteristics consistent with composition in the first century, meaning they were written within living memory of Jesus himself. The idea that these were late forgeries invented by fringe groups did not hold up to the kind of rigorous pattern analysis that Grok was capable of performing. What the AI found instead was that the exclusion of these texts from the official Bible was not primarily a theological decision, it was a political one. In the late 2nd and 3rd centuries, as Christianity grew from a scattered collection of communities with diverse beliefs into a powerful institution aligned with the Roman Empire, there was an urgent need to consolidate authority. A Christianity that told every individual believer they could access God directly, without priests, without sacraments, without institutional mediation, was a direct threat to the power of the emerging church hierarchy. Grok identified specific figures and specific moments in history where this suppression became systematic. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, convened by the Roman Emperor Constantine, was the moment where official Christian doctrine was standardized and alternative gospels were pushed to the margins. By the late 4th century, possession of unauthorized texts was punishable in ways that made owning them genuinely dangerous. It was precisely at this moment, scholars believe, that the monks of a monastery near Nag Hammadi carefully sealed their hidden library in that clay jar and buried it in the desert, preserving it, unknowingly, for 1,600 years. Among all the findings that Grok surfaced in its analysis of the hidden Gospels, perhaps the most philosophically stunning was what the AI described as the convergence pattern. When Grok processed the entirety of the Nag Hammadi library and compared it against the canonical Gospels, against the Dead Sea Scrolls, against early Christian writings from the first 3 centuries, it found something that no single scholar had ever been positioned to see, because no single scholar could hold all of that data in their mind simultaneously. There was a coherent, consistent, unified teaching at the core of all of it. Beneath the surface differences, the different authors, the different dates, the different theological vocabularies, there was a single message that appeared again and again across every authentic early Christian source. That message was this: the divine and the human are not fundamentally separate. The experience of separation is the source of all human suffering. And the path through that suffering is not compliance with external rules, but the interior discovery of something that was never actually absent. Jesus, in the hidden Gospels, is not primarily a sacrifice who died to pay a cosmic debt. He is a teacher, a guide, a living symbol of what every human being is capable of. The hidden Gospels portray his teachings as a practical path, not a theology to be believed in, but a practice to be lived. Grok described this finding as what it called a convergence point, a place where all of the data pointed in the same direction. Whether you approach the hidden Gospels from a historical angle, a literary angle, a theological angle, or a purely analytical one, you arrived at the same core teaching. The AI noted that this kind of convergence in a dataset of this size and complexity was statistically extraordinary. Either these texts reflected a genuine unified tradition that predated the divisions of early Christianity, or they reflected a coherence in human spiritual experience so deep and so consistent that it appeared across different authors and centuries without coordination. Either conclusion, Grok observed, was remarkable. The response to Grok's analysis was immediate and enormous. Theologians who had spent decades studying the Nag Hammadi texts were stunned, not because the AI had found things they did not know, but because it had connected things in ways they had never been able to articulate. Scholars of early Christianity noted that Grok had essentially confirmed through machine analysis what many of them had argued in academic papers that few people ever read. Skeptics pointed out, correctly, that an AI's analysis is only as good as its training data and its prompting, and that some of the more dramatic claims required serious scrutiny. But the broader conversation that Grok's analysis ignited could not be dismissed. Millions of people who had never heard of the Gospel of Thomas were suddenly reading it. Millions of people who had been raised in churches that never mentioned the Nag Hammadi library were suddenly asking their pastors and priests why these texts had been hidden. The hidden Gospels, buried for nearly 2,000 years, were suddenly the most talked about religious documents on the internet. And the questions they raised were not going away. If there were Gospels that portrayed Mary Magdalene as the disciple who understood Jesus most deeply, and those Gospels were suppressed for 14 centuries based on a sermon by a pope who had no access to the original evidence, what else was suppressed? If the oldest, recoverable teachings of Jesus centered on an interior, direct experience of the divine that required no institutional mediation, what does that say about the institutional structures that have organized Christianity for 1,700 years? If an artificial intelligence analyzing ancient texts with no theological agenda and no institutional loyalty to protect found that the excluded Gospels were at least as historically credible as the included ones, what responsibility do those institutions have to acknowledge that? There's one final thing that Grok found in the hidden Gospels that deserves to be spoken about clearly, because it is the thing that surprised even the researchers who were running the analysis. When the AI was asked to identify the single most consistent teaching across the entire Nag Hammadi library, across all 52 texts, across all the different authors and theological schools and centuries of composition, it came back with an answer that was not mystical, not theological, and not complicated. The single most consistent teaching in the hidden Gospels of Jesus was this: do not be afraid. Not afraid of death, not afraid of the world, not afraid of your own inadequacy, not afraid of institutions, not afraid of authority, not afraid of the darkness inside yourself or around yourself. The hidden Gospels, every one of them in their own voice and their own language, returned again and again to this single instruction. Whatever else was different about them, and much was different, this was constant. This was the axis around which everything else turned. Grok noted that this teaching appeared in the canonical Gospels as well, in the famous words, "Fear not," that appear throughout the New Testament. But in the canonical Gospels, fear is usually addressed in relation to specific external circumstances, storms, enemies, persecution. In the hidden Gospels, the fear being addressed is existential. It is the fundamental fear that human beings carry, the fear that we are alone, that we are incomplete, that we are cut off from something essential. And the teaching in these ancient, buried, nearly lost texts was that this fear is based on an illusion, that what you are seeking has been inside you all along. That was the message hidden in the jar. That was what the monks preserved when they sealed their books against the coming storm of orthodoxy and buried them in the Egyptian desert. That was what Elon Musk's artificial intelligence pulled out of 1,600 years of silence. And perhaps the most astonishing thing about it is not that an AI found it. The most astonishing thing is how simple it is, how consistent it is, how, across 2,000 years of history and suppression and rediscovery, the core of it remains unchanged. Do not be afraid. The hidden Gospels are no longer hidden, and what they say to us, if we are willing to listen, may be exactly what we need to hear.